On the evening I went to the wrong wedding, Chicago wore its finest disguise. Rain had polished the paving stones until every electric lamp on Wabash Avenue appeared twice, once in the air and once beneath the wheels of the carriages. The elevated trains thundered around the loop like iron weather. Horses steamed in the damp, motor cars coughed blue smoke beside them, and ladies gathered their skirts above the gutters while hotel porters hurried beneath black umbrellas. From a distance, the city looked rich enough to have bought the moon. Up close, it smelled of wet wool, horse dung, coal smoke, and the river. I stood beneath the striped awning of Hawthorn House and pretended to search the arriving guests for a familiar face. In truth, I was trying to remember the bride's Christian name. I knew her surname was Bell. At least I believed it was Bell. She worked in the purchasing offices of Fairchild and Moore, 3 floors below the correspondence room where I kept invoices, corrected orders, and made certain that other people's carelessness did not cost the firm money. During the previous 6 months, the bride and I had spoken perhaps 4 times. Once we had shared an elevator. Once I had lent her a pencil. Twice she had asked whether a shipment ledger had come through my department. She had invited nearly every woman in the office because drawing a line between acquaintances and strangers would have required an awkwardness she did not possess. I had accepted for much the same reason. Refusal required an explanation, and explanations invited questions. At 31, an unmarried woman learned to ration the facts of her life. If she spent Saturday evening alone, people pitied her. If she admitted that she preferred an evening alone, they distrusted her. If she attended a wedding without an escort, they searched the room for a man who might rescue her from that condition. There was no answer that did not become evidence. So I had bought a pair of pearl gray gloves I could not afford, altered the blue silk dress my sister had worn before moving to Milwaukee, and taken the streetcar south with a wrapped silver-plated sugar bowl on my lap. I had come because it was simpler than staying away. The awning sheltered a bright confusion of guests. Men surrendered hats and umbrellas to attendants. Women embraced beneath ostrich plumes and jeweled combs. Somewhere inside, a string orchestra was playing a waltz with enough enthusiasm to shake the window glass. I recognized no one. That did not trouble me at first. I decided that the unfamiliar guests must belong to the groom. Then a man beside me observed that I appeared to know as little about the bridal couple as he did. I turned and found him watching the crowd with the grave concentration of a mechanic facing an unfamiliar engine. He looked a little past 40. His coat was charcoal wool, well brushed but plainly cut, and his white shirt had been starched by someone who valued discipline more than comfort. He wore no evening tie. His hands were broad, the knuckles marked with old nicks, and a dark crescent remained beneath each thumbnail, despite a determined washing. Machine oil left a signature that ordinary soap could not erase. I admitted that my knowledge was not extensive, and asked how he came to be there. The bride, he explained, had invited him after he repaired the steering gear on her father's motorcar. He had spent half a day beneath the machine in an alley while she carried messages between him and the household. At the end, she had said that he ought to attend her wedding because there would be music, food, and more cheerful company than he was likely to find in his workshop. He had not possessed the necessary hardness to decline. There was a restraint in the way he told it, as though he had already judged his own decision foolish and needed no assistance from me. I found myself amused, although I did not show it. A man who attended the wedding of a nearly unknown customer was either dangerously odd or very lonely. The distinction mattered, but I had not yet learned enough to make it. He gave his name as Samuel Mercer. I gave mine as Eleanor Hale. We shook hands, an improper little business-like gesture beneath an awning crowded with satin and flowers. His palm was warm and dry. I noticed that because my own hand was cold. An attendant called for guests of the Harcourt wedding to proceed upstairs. Samuel glanced toward the stairway and then at me. I heard Harcourt and assumed it belonged to the groom. He had heard the bride's name in a noisy alley beside a running engine and was no more certain than I was. Thus, two cautious people, each trusting the uncertainty of the other, allowed themselves to be carried inside with the crowd. Hawthorn House had been built when Chicago's millionaires still tried to make their hotels resemble European palaces. The vestibule was all marble pillars, gilt acanthus leaves, red velvet, and electric globes shaped like candle flames. The ballroom beyond had a painted ceiling in which rosy clouds supported an assembly of half-dressed angels. Palms in brass tubs lined the walls. White roses climbed a trellis above the bridal table, though it was not yet the season for them, and the expense of forcing so many blossoms into existence seemed to me almost indecent. The room was bright enough to expose every worn cuff and false jewel. I searched again for women from Fairchild and Moore. I saw none. A young hostess in a white apron directed friends of the bride to the long table on the right. Samuel asked whether I belonged with them. Because I believed that I did, and because hesitation had already begun to feel ridiculous, I said that I probably did. We took adjacent chairs beneath a bank of ferns. People settled around us with the easy noise of families that had celebrated and quarreled together for years. A red-cheeked woman in plum satin touched my sleeve and asked how long Samuel and I had been married. Before I could correct her, she remembered that Lydia had mentioned inviting several people connected with the motorcar and concluded that Samuel must be the clever fellow who had saved Mr. Harcourt from buying a new steering assembly. The name Lydia struck me more sharply than the elevated train passing outside. The woman continued happily, explaining that Lydia was too generous and that half the room consisted of people she had met only once. She took my presence as further proof of the bride's open heart. I smiled, while something cold gathered beneath my ribs. The woman I knew from purchasing was not Lydia Harcourt. Her name was Catherine Bell. I remembered it now with perfect clarity. Catherine wore wire spectacles and kept lemon drops in the second drawer of her desk. She had spoken for 2 weeks about marrying George Merritt, a salesman for a paper company in Evanston. I had even helped compare the prices of 2 caterers during our noon interval. I opened my reticule and drew out the invitation. Its cream card was thick enough to make a visiting card seem shabby. Beneath the embossed bellflowers appeared the address of the Hawthorn Assembly Rooms at 241 Wabash Avenue. I lifted my eyes to the monogram woven into the linen napkin before me. The hotel was Hawthorn House, without the final E, at 214 Wabash Avenue. The difference was 3 letters and 2 transposed numbers. Catherine Bell's wedding was taking place less than 3 blocks away. My chair, my supper, and perhaps even a printed placard were waiting there. Yet I was sitting beneath imported roses at the wedding of Lydia Harcourt, a woman I had never seen, beside a man who had repaired a motorcar in an alley and could not refuse invitations. I had entered the wrong building, surrendered my wrap, handed my gift to a stranger, and taken my place at someone else's feast. For one suspended moment, the whole enormous city seemed to have arranged itself around my mistake. Second Samuel noticed the change in my face. I handed him the invitation beneath the edge of the table. He read the address once, studied the linen monogram, and read it again. The muscles around his mouth tightened. He covered them with his hand, but his eyes betrayed him. I informed him in a whisper that laughter would be unkind. He agreed, though his shoulders moved once with the effort of containing it. When he had recovered, he described the error as the most remarkable thing he had heard in several years. I considered it a catastrophe. He considered it an accidental improvement to the evening. My first instinct was to rise at once, retrieve my coat and sugar bowl, and hurry up Wabash Avenue before Catherine's wedding breakfast had progressed beyond the soup. Respectability depended on being found where one was expected. A single woman who wandered into an unknown wedding and sat beside an unknown man might be innocent, but innocence was less useful than appearances. Samuel did not try to restrain me. He merely pointed out the facts. No one at Hawthorn House knew me. Almost no one knew him. Lydia had apparently invited tradesmen, old school companions, distant cousins, and persons encountered during household emergencies. My presence had already been explained by the red-cheeked woman as an extension of the bride's generosity. If I left abruptly, I would invite more notice than if I remained. Meanwhile, he would be grateful for an ally who knew as little as he did. There was sense in his argument, which made it dangerous. I looked toward the doors. 2 footmen were closing them because the bridal procession had begun. Rising now would require me to cross the entire ballroom under the gaze of nearly 100 guests. I remained seated. The bride entered on her father's arm, small and shining beneath a cloud of lace. I recognized her after all. 3 weeks earlier, I had seen her in the passenger seat of a crimson motor car stalled near State Street. Samuel had been bent over the open bonnet while she held an umbrella above him in a manner that protected neither of them. At the time, I had scarcely noticed her. Now I watched her approach beneath the white roses and wondered how an unknown woman's wedding had managed to close around me like a trap. The ceremony had taken place at a church that afternoon, so Hawthorn House was given over to supper, toasts, music, and display. Waiters advanced in formation carrying plates of clear soup. Silver flashed. Champagne foamed into shallow glasses. A photographer ignited powder near the doorway, producing a white explosion and a cloud that smelled of scorched metal. The guests around us assumed that Samuel and I had arrived together. At first we corrected them. Our corrections were repeatedly misunderstood. The red-cheeked woman decided we were courting rather than married. An elderly aunt decided that I must be Samuel's fiancée, because no respectable woman would attend such an affair in a tradesman's company without an understanding. A young cousin asked when our own announcement would appear in the Tribune. Each denial required a longer explanation. Each explanation approached the humiliating truth of my presence. I could feel the story escaping us, gathering details as it traveled from chair to chair. At last, Samuel told the aunt that we had known each other for 3 years. I nearly dropped my spoon. He gave me a look that combined apology with invitation. It was the first truly reckless expression I had seen on his face. I could have exposed him. Instead, I added that we had met by accident. The relief around the table was immediate. A courtship required no further defense. The women softened toward me. The men accepted Samuel as a person whose place in the room could be understood. We had given society the shape it wanted, and in return, it ceased asking whether we belonged. Unfortunately, it began asking for details. Over the fish course, Samuel established that our first meeting had occurred at a street crossing after my hired cab lost a wheel. I corrected him and made it a motor car borrowed from my employer, because a man who repaired machines would have no reason to chase a disabled cab. He then claimed that I had ignored his first offer of help. I explained that his manner had been overconfident. He suggested that my gratitude had been concealed by pride. I suggested that his memory favored him unfairly. By the arrival of roast duck, we had built an entire past. In our invented history, the disabled motor car had stood at the corner of Michigan Avenue and Jackson Boulevard. Samuel had replaced a broken pin while I held a lantern. I had driven away without giving him my name. For 3 evenings afterward, he had returned to the intersection at the same hour, hoping the car would pass again. On the 4th evening, I had returned, supposedly to thank him properly. though the table understood that curiosity had been the stronger motive. We had taken coffee at a restaurant beneath the elevated tracks. I had disapproved of the noise and of his hands. He had admired my hat. We had quarreled twice before deciding to court, and had continued quarreling at regular intervals ever since. It should have been difficult to lie with a stranger. Instead, it felt like joining a dance when one already knew the music. Samuel never seized the story from me. He left spaces and I filled them. When I changed a detail, he adapted without hesitation. When he introduced a new turn, I understood where he meant it to lead. The invention passed between us until neither could have said who had created which part. Our listeners were delighted. They recognized the familiar structure of romance: accident, resistance, persistence, surrender. No one asked whether it was true because it sounded the way truth was expected to sound. I began to feel the strangest double consciousness. One part of me remained Eleanor Hale, a senior invoice clerk with an overdue gas bill and a place waiting at another wedding. The other remembered rain on Jackson Boulevard that had never fallen. She remembered holding a lantern above Samuel's dark head. She remembered returning to the crossing and discovering him there. That woman had been expected. I envied her. 3. Between the duck and the molded ice, I escaped to a small balcony at the end of the ballroom. The rain had stopped. Below me, the city moved through its Saturday evening with complete indifference to bridal flowers and mistaken addresses. Streetcars rang their bells at wagons blocking the rails. Newsboys hurried between theaters with late editions under their arms. The elevated train exposed rows of bright windows and vanished around a curve. Catherine's wedding was close enough that I might have seen its lamps if I knew which windows to count. I imagined the women from the office seated together, their conversation moving from gowns to wages to the superintendent's new rule about tardiness. Someone might have noticed the empty chair. More likely, my absence had been absorbed without difficulty. Fairchild and Moore employed 47 women in the purchasing and correspondence divisions. If one failed to appear at a crowded wedding, the room did not change shape. Samuel joined me after several minutes. He had brought my wrap, though I had not asked for it. He placed it over the stone rail before coming near, an act of consideration so unobtrusive that it affected me more than gallantry would have. He wondered whether I was preparing to flee. I told him that I was considering it. He accepted that. He had a way of leaving room around another person's answer. Most men I knew treated silence as land available for occupation. Samuel allowed it to remain empty. The air smelled of rain and soot. I confessed that I could not understand what I was doing at an unknown celebration, inventing a courtship with a man whose name I had learned during the appetizer. He conceded that it was absurd. He also observed that I had not looked bored once. That was true, and I resented him mildly for seeing it. For 4 years, my life had been orderly enough to pass inspection. I rose at 6, heated water on the stove, and ate toast beside the window of my boarding house room. I took the same streetcar downtown. I worked until 5:30 beneath electric lights that made everyone look tired. On Tuesdays, I helped my landlady with accounts. On Thursdays, I visited the reading room at the public library. Every other Sunday, I took the train to Oak Park to dine with my widowed sister and her 2 solemn children. I called this independence because it was a better word than solitude. There had been a man once, but even in memory he seemed less a person than a plan I had nearly accepted. Charles Whitcomb had worked in the credit office. He approved of my penmanship, my restraint, and my ability to manage a household on a narrow allowance. After 8 months, he proposed that I leave Fairchild and Moore, move into his mother's house, and devote myself to making the arrangement agreeable to all 3 of us. I declined. He married a 19-year-old within the year. Since then, I had become skilled at describing my solitude as a choice. Much of it was. The trouble was that choices hardened when repeated. A road walked daily became the only road one could imagine. I asked Samuel how long he had been alone. He looked across the roofs before explaining that his marriage had ended 3 years earlier. Divorce was still spoken of quietly, even in a city where every other moral certainty could be purchased or evaded. He did not offer the reasons at first. He said only that he had expected the loneliness to be temporary. He had believed that work, time, and the movement of the city would carry him toward another life. Instead, work had filled every empty space and called itself a life. His days began before mine. He owned half of a machine shop on Indiana Avenue with a partner named Thomas Reed. They repaired printing presses, laundry engines, pumps, and the increasing number of motor cars owned by men who purchased speed before learning patience. Samuel rented 2 rooms above a German baker on 31st Street. On some evenings, he shared beer with Thomas. On others, he read the newspaper until the words blurred and slept in his chair. The familiarity of his routine unsettled us both. Different streets, different work, the same careful narrowing. Below, a motor car backfired. A horse shied against its traces, and the driver cursed with professional fluency. Samuel leaned over the rail to watch until the animal settled. His profile under the electric light was not handsome in the polished fashion of department store advertisements. His nose had been broken long ago. A pale scar crossed the edge of his jaw. There were fine lines at his eyes, though he did not seem to smile often enough to have earned them. Yet his face had the restful quality of something made for use, rather than display. He suggested that we return, before our absence became the subject of another invented chapter. I asked whether he always yielded so easily to other people's expectations. He considered this before admitting that he often did. Refusal, he said, made a man responsible for disappointing someone. Agreement merely made him responsible for himself, and he had always found his own inconvenience insecurity to bear. I recognized the habit. It was the reason I wore grey gloves and had purchased a sugar bowl for Catherine Bell. It was also the reason I stood on that balcony. Without planning to, I told him that perhaps our difficulty was not loneliness, but obedience. He looked at me then, fully and quietly, as though I had named a fault in an engine that had troubled him for years. The orchestra began another waltz inside. Samuel offered his arm with mock ceremony, but the humor did not conceal the gentleness of the gesture. I took it. 4. The Harcourt family had engaged a master of ceremonies whose whiskers, waistcoat, and confidence were equally magnificent. He managed the evening as though conducting a political convention. He introduced the toasts, directed the orchestra, announced the cutting of the cake, and persuaded reluctant relatives to perform songs they had last sung in childhood. After dessert, he proposed an entertainment concerning courtship. The longest married couple, the newlyweds, and one pair chosen by the guests would each give an account of how they had met. The room would decide by applause which history offered the finest proof of devotion. Before I understood the danger, the red-cheeked woman nominated Samuel and me. Several neighbors supported her. Our invented romance had traveled. The version returning to us now included a thunderstorm, a runaway horse, and Samuel carrying me through floodwater. Falsehood, like finance, accumulated value through circulation. I tried to make myself invisible behind a palm. Samuel became very still. The master of ceremonies was already approaching our table, propelled by the enthusiasm of a man who had never doubted his welcome. Refusal would require a public explanation. Acceptance would carry our private game into the center of the ballroom. Samuel turned to me. In his expression, I saw that he would follow my decision. That freedom frightened me more than pressure would have. I rose. We stood beneath the arch of roses beside the other two couples. The first were Lydia's parents, married 34 years. Their meeting had occurred at a church picnic on the shore of Lake Michigan. A sudden wind had carried Mrs. Harcourt's hat into the water, and Mr. Harcourt had ruined his boots retrieving it. Their children had heard the story many times, but the room received each detail with affection. What mattered was not novelty, it was survival. The hat, the wet boots, the picnic, and all the years after had become a single family possession. Lydia and her new husband followed. They had met at a charity exhibition for settlement houses. He had mistaken her for a volunteer and asked her to direct him to the coat room. She had disliked his manner, then discovered that he had financed half the exhibition without allowing his name on the program. Their account contained embarrassment, correction, and the satisfying triumph of character over first impressions. Then the master of ceremonies turned to us. The room waited. Samuel began with the disabled motorcar at Michigan and Jackson. He described me standing beside it in a blue dress, furious at the broken steering pin, and more furious that I needed assistance. I had not worn blue in our earlier invention. I was wearing blue now. He described offering help and receiving gratitude in a tone cold enough to preserve meat. The audience laughed. I felt heat rise into my face, because although the incident was false, the description of my pride was exact. I continued the account in indirect phrases, explaining how I had driven away convinced that I would never see the mechanic again. Samuel then added that for 3 days he had been unable to forget me. He had returned to the same corner each evening at 6, enduring smoke, traffic, and the ridicule of a policeman who assumed he was waiting to collect a debt. This detail had not existed before. The humor passed through the room, but beneath it, I heard something in Samuel's voice change. He was no longer playing for the table. I said that when he finally saw the motor car again, he had followed it as far as the next signal and asked whether he might call it my home. I had refused. He had watched me drive away and believed the matter ended. The orchestra had gone quiet. Glasses no longer touched plates. 100 strangers listened to the history we had not lived. I do not know why I changed it then. Perhaps the room demanded a conclusion. Perhaps I wanted to give the imaginary woman what I had denied myself too often. I explained that the following evening I had returned to the crossing. I pretended that I wished to make certain the repair was sound, though I had known there was nothing wrong with the machine. I had returned because for one day I had been unable to forget him either. Samuel looked at me with such naked surprise that the ballroom disappeared. He finished by saying that people sometimes returned, though a wise man did not build his life upon the hope. When they did return, however, he ought to be present. Silence followed. For several seconds I could hear the small electrical hum of the chandeliers. Then the applause began. It rose from the tables in a wave, warm and astonishing. The red-cheeked woman wept openly. Someone near the orchestra shouted approval. Mr. Harcourt clapped Samuel on the shoulder, and Lydia herself smiled at us from beneath her veil, as if our happiness had added something to hers. We won the silver keepsake box offered as a prize. I accepted it with hands that trembled. 2 strangers had told a lie, and everyone in the room had recognized a truth. Back at the table, neither of us spoke for some time. Samuel poured water and moved the glass toward me. The simple motion steadied me. I reminded him that none of it had happened. He acknowledged that. I wanted him to explain why it felt as though something had. I could not frame the question without exposing how deeply the performance had reached me. At last, he studied his stained thumbnails and admitted that the 3 evenings at the crossing had not been wholly invented. After his wife left, he had waited for her return. Her name was Margaret. They had married young, before he understood that endurance and affection were not the same thing. For 12 years they had tried to build a marriage from habits, debts, small resentments, and the memory of tenderness. When Margaret went to live with her sister in St. Louis, Samuel assumed she needed a month away. A letter from an attorney arrived instead. For 3 months, he came home each evening and looked at the telephone in the downstairs bakery. Every ring drew him halfway down the stairs. He imagined Margaret reconsidering, imagined her voice traveling along hundreds of miles of wire to restore the life they had failed to value properly. The call never came. Even after the decree, some foolish part of him continued to listen. While telling the invented story, he had not seen a motor car at an intersection. He had seen that black telephone on the baker's wall. I understood then why his voice had changed. He had concealed a confession inside a fable, because a room of strangers was safer than one attentive woman. My own addition had been no less true. I had returned to people, places, and hopes long after they proved unworthy. I had passed the credit office after Charles married, pretending it was the shortest route. I had attended gatherings where I knew he would appear. I had revised old conversations until his proposal seemed almost generous. I had not wanted Charles himself. I had wanted evidence that the door to an ordinary life had not closed. I told Samuel that I had always returned to the wrong things. The wedding continued around us. The orchestra struck up a two-step. Children stole icing from the cake. The photographer arranged 3 generations of Harcourts beneath the roses and ordered them to remain still. Our table-mates had gone to dance, leaving an island of rumpled linen, empty glasses, and extinguished candles. Samuel did not offer comfort. I was grateful. Comfort given too quickly can feel like a refusal to look at the wound. He simply remained beside me. I took Catherine Bell's invitation from my reticule. The address seemed absurdly obvious now. At Hawthorn Assembly Rooms, my colleagues would be finishing dessert. Catherine would be dancing with George. The silver sugar bowl I had intended for them sat somewhere among Lydia Harcourt's gifts, tagged only with my name. I could still leave. If I hurried, I could arrive in time to offer an excuse about streetcar trouble. Samuel asked whether it was time for me to go. His manner contained no plea. He seemed already prepared to accept my departure as the natural conclusion to an accidental evening. That readiness disturbed me. It resembled my own habit of expecting to be unnecessary. I folded the invitation once, then again, and returned it to my reticule. I told him that it was not time. The decision was small. It altered the course of my life. The orchestra moved into a slow waltz. Samuel asked whether I would dance. He did so with the caution of a man approaching machinery whose instructions had been misplaced. I admitted that my dancing was unreliable. His was worse, he said, and therefore we would be evenly matched. We joined the couples beneath the chandeliers. His hand rested lightly at my waist. Mine lay on the shoulder of his plain coat. He smelled of shaving soap, rain, and the faint mineral scent of the workshop that no amount of washing removed. We moved perhaps 6 inches in either direction. Once he stepped on the edge of my skirt. Once I collided with an elderly gentleman. Yet I had never felt less observed. Around us were other people's relations, reputations, and remembered histories. No one knew that I had spent 4 years teaching myself not to need anyone. No one knew that Samuel still listened for a telephone that would not ring. For the length of the waltz, we were allowed to be the people we had invented, a woman capable of returning and a man willing to wait. When the music ended, neither of us moved away immediately. I asked, in a voice nearly lost beneath the applause, whether he had meant the final sentence of our story. He understood. He said that he had meant more of it than was sensible. Then he asked whether I would return after that night, Not to Hawthorn House, but to him. I looked at the man I had known for less than 4 hours. Prudence presented its objections in orderly columns. He was divorced. He was a tradesman. I knew nothing of his debts, his temper, or his habits beyond an inability to decline invitations. He knew nothing of mine beyond a mistake and a lie. But prudence had governed me faithfully for years, and it had brought me to an empty room in a boarding house where even my books seemed to wait for permission to speak. I said that I would return. 6. The reception ended near midnight. Guests departed beneath the awning in groups, calling for carriages and motor cars, while a fine mist silvered the street. Lydia and her husband remained beneath the roses for one final photograph. The master of ceremonies packed his cards into a leather case. Waiters cleared the evidence of abundance. Samuel and I sat among the last guests, reluctant to test whether our invented ease could survive outside the ballroom. He asked for my address so that he might call properly. I gave him the name of my boarding house on Prairie Avenue, but not the room number. Then, astonished by my own boldness, I gave him the telephone number at Fairchild and Moore and explained the hours during which the switchboard girl was least likely to listen. He wrote both on the back of a shop invoice. His pencil was flat, the sort carpenters used, and the paper bore the printed heading of Mercer and Reed Mechanical Repairs. The romance of our circumstances did not survive the sight of a charge for 2 new brass bushings, but I trusted the invoice more than I would have trusted an engraved card. He asked whether I would dine with him the following evening. The invitation was plain, almost solemn. He did not claim knowledge of fashionable restaurants. He knew a German place near his rooms where the soup was hot, the bread was fresh, and no one minded workmen's hands. I accepted. At the coat room, I attempted to recover my gift. The attendant had already sent all packages to the bridal suite. My silver sugar bowl had disappeared into the Harcourt household, while Catherine Bell would receive nothing but my absence. The absurdity seemed complete. Samuel promised to explain the gift to Lydia when he next serviced the motor car. I pictured him beneath the crimson machine, informing the bride that a strange woman had accidentally financed her morning coffee. The image made me laugh so suddenly that the attendant smiled despite herself. Outside, Samuel waited with me beneath the awning. A hired cab took 20 minutes to arrive. We spoke little. The city after midnight had a stripped, working face. Street sweepers pushed mud toward the gutters. Bakery wagons began their rounds. The lights of newspaper offices burned above Dearborn Street. Wealth slept behind stone, while labor prepared its breakfast. When my cab came, Samuel helped me inside. He did not attempt to kiss or even hold my hand longer than courtesy required. He said that he would call at 7 the next evening. I watched him through the rear window as the cab pulled away. He remained beneath the hotel lamp, hat in hand, until rain and distance erased him. The driver turned north instead of south, and for one frightened instant, I thought I had made another error. Then I recognized the route around construction. We passed Hawthorn assembly rooms at 12 minutes after midnight. Its entrance was dark. A porter was sweeping rice from the pavement. One bent white flower lay in the gutter, and a wagon at the service door received empty crates. Catherine's wedding was over. I felt a brief stab of guilt, followed by an unexpected relief. The life I had been meant to witness had occurred without me. No catastrophe followed. The city had not stopped. Catherine was married, my chair had been cleared, and I remained free. In my room, I removed the pearl-grey gloves and laid them beside the useless invitation. Coal in the grate had burned low. The familiar washstand, narrow bed, and wallpaper of faded violets looked both smaller and dearer than they had that morning. I expected regret to arrive with the silence. Instead, I kept remembering Samuel's face when I said that the imaginary woman had returned. I slept badly and woke happy. 7. The next morning, happiness proved no protection against consequences. At breakfast, Mrs. Dunn, my landlady, placed a note beside my coffee. It had arrived by messenger from Fairchild and Moore shortly after 8. Catherine Merritt, formerly Catherine Bell, wished to know whether illness had prevented my attendance and hoped I had not been injured. Her concern was sincere enough to make my behavior appear worse. I spent an hour composing an explanation. Every honest version sounded deranged. I had confused two nearly identical names, entered the wrong establishment, remained through supper, pretended to court a mechanic, performed a false history before a room of strangers, and enjoyed myself too much to leave. The respectable version required only a sudden headache. For the first time in my adult life, I found respectability intolerably dull. I wrote that I had mistaken the address and arrived too late to correct the error. This was true, if incomplete. I enclosed enough money to replace the missing sugar bowl and offered my good wishes without inventing an illness. The note felt inadequate, but at least it belonged to me. At 6:30 that evening, I stood before the mirror in my room and considered changing my dress for the third time. The absurdity of dressing carefully for a man who had first seen me in borrowed silk was not lost on me. I finally chose a brown walking suit with a cream collar, then removed the collar because it made me look like a schoolmistress. At 6:55 I went downstairs. Samuel was already in the parlour, sitting on the edge of a horsehair chair beneath a portrait of Mrs. Dunn's dead husband. He had brought tulips wrapped in newspaper. They were yellow, slightly bruised, and infinitely more beautiful than the white roses forced into bloom at Hawthorn House. Mrs. Dunn watched from the doorway while we greeted one another. Her supervision did not offend me. A landlady's vigilance was one of the prices paid by women who wanted rooms without questions from the police or charitable societies. Samuel seemed to understand the arrangement. He gave his full name, profession, and business address before she asked. By the time we left, Mrs. Dunn knew more about him than I did at the end of the wedding. We took the streetcar south. In daylight, his neighborhood seemed to belong to a different city from the hotels of Wabash Avenue. 2-story brick buildings stood beside lumber yards and coal depots. Laundry hung behind narrow houses. Children played ball in alleys where delivery wagons had left deep ruts. The air carried yeast from the bakery, smoke from the rail yards, and a sour breath from the stockyards when the wind shifted. Samuel watched me take it in. He appeared to be waiting for disappointment. I told him that Fairchild and Moore bought half its household goods from factories in streets like these, though its advertisements pretended merchandise appeared by magic beneath chandeliers. I had visited warehouses often enough to understand where elegance began. The German restaurant occupied the ground floor of the building where he lived. It was clean, crowded, and warm. Men from the rail shops sat with their families beneath dark wooden beams. A stout widow named Mrs. Bauer ruled the room and the bakery next door. She received Samuel with the affection of someone who knew his faults and had chosen to feed him anyway. Her appraising glance moved over me, my gloves, and the space between us. She seated us at a small table near the window and sent soup before we ordered. Our first real conversation was more difficult than the false one. At Hawthorn House, invention had protected us. If a question became uncomfortable, we could answer as our imaginary selves. Now each fact carried weight. Samuel told me that he had grown up in a village near Rockford, the second of 5 sons born to a millwright. At 14, he left school to work beside his father. He came to Chicago before the Great World's Fair, when the White City was still a marsh of scaffolds and ambition. He had helped install pumps in one of the exhibition buildings. For 6 months, he watched palaces of plaster rise beside the lake, glowing at night with more electric light than some towns saw in a year. Then the fair ended, the buildings emptied, and men who had created them stood in bread lines during the Panic of 1893. That lesson remained with him. Everything splendid had pipes behind it. Every fortune rested on work the fortunate preferred not to see. Every shining city could become scaffolding again. I told him about my childhood in Fort Wayne. My father taught bookkeeping at a commercial college and believed his daughters should be able to support themselves, though he also believed they should cease doing so upon marriage. After his death, I came to Chicago because the city paid women $7 a week for work that earned them $4 in Indiana. 12 years later, I earned $16. The increase sounded impressive until rent, coal, laundry, meals, streetcar fares, church envelopes, and respectable clothing divided it among themselves. We spoke of the city, of machines, of the campaign against child labor, and of the new municipal sanitation ordinances that filled newspapers with righteous language, while garbage still accumulated behind tenements. Samuel had little patience for men who praised progress from offices warmed by other people's coal. I had little patience for men who dismissed reform because it arrived imperfectly. Our disagreement sharpened. At the wedding, it would have become playful fiction. At the restaurant, it became a discovery. I liked that he argued without trying to reduce me. He listened to the whole of an idea before opposing it. When he changed his mind, he did not pretend he had always agreed. When he believed me wrong, he trusted me enough to say so. After supper, he showed me the workshop. Mercer and Reed occupied a brick carriage house behind a printing company. The front room contained a long bench, racks of tools, and an office enclosed by glass panels. The larger bay held a delivery wagon with its rear axle removed, a small printing press awaiting repair, and 2 motor cars beneath canvas covers. Belts hung motionless from overhead shafts. Metal filings glittered in corners like dark frost. The place smelled of oil, hot iron, leather, and effort. Samuel lit a row of electric bulbs. Pride altered his face. In the ballroom, he had seemed like an accidental guest. Here, every object answered to his hands. He showed me a differential gear from a French motor car and explained how power turned a corner inside the casing. I understood perhaps 1 word in 3, but his care made the machinery beautiful. He did not describe engines as though they were alive. He respected them too much for sentimentality. Machines behaved according to forces, tolerances, and flaws. Mystery was usually ignorance wearing perfume. On the office desk, I noticed 3 stacks of unpaid accounts and a ledger open to a page crowded with corrections. The numbers leaned at different angles. Several totals were wrong. Samuel saw me studying them and looked embarrassed. Thomas Reed kept the books, he explained, but Thomas preferred invention to arithmetic. Customers delayed payment, suppliers demanded cash, and the business often knew it had earned money without knowing where the money had gone. I asked permission to examine the ledger. Within 10 minutes, I found a duplicated payment for steel stock and 2 repairs never transferred from work tickets to invoices. Samuel watched as if I had pulled coins from the paper. It was my turn to explain a machine. I showed him how accounts moved through a business, how one figure drove another, and how an error no larger than a missing digit could stop the whole arrangement. He listened with the same concentration he had given the ballroom crowd. For years, men at Fairchild and Moore had treated my accuracy as a feminine virtue, like neat stitching. Samuel understood it as skill. That understanding was the first thing about him I trusted completely. He walked me home along Michigan Avenue. The night was clear and the lake wind pressed hard against us. At the boarding house steps, he thanked me for returning. I reminded him that he had not waited at an intersection. He answered that waiting was waiting, no matter the location. We did not kiss. Mrs. Dunn's curtain moved above us, and both of us noticed. Yet after I went inside, the evening did not feel incomplete. It felt begun. By June, our courtship had acquired a schedule. Samuel called at the boarding house on Wednesday evenings and Sundays. On some Saturdays, I visited the workshop during daylight, bringing sandwiches and imposing order on the office, while Thomas Reed treated my presence as a minor miracle. Thomas was younger than Samuel by 10 years, narrow as a folding ruler, and incapable of finding a pencil placed directly before him. He could design a pump from memory, rebuild a cracked cylinder, and forget to charge for either. Within a month, I had arranged the accounts by customer, created duplicate work orders, and proved that Mercer and Reed was owed nearly $900. I refused payment. Samuel objected. I argued that a woman ought to be allowed to give time as freely as a man gave tulips. He eventually accepted, though he began bringing small repairs from the boarding house into his shop without charge. The gate stopped sagging. The boiler ceased its midnight knocking. Mrs. Dunn's ancient sewing machine ran so quietly that she forgave him for keeping me out until 10 on a Sunday. We learned Chicago together, though both of us had lived there for years. We walked along the lake, where stone revetments held back gray water. We attended a free lecture at Hawthorn House on workplace safety, and quarreled afterward about whether factory inspectors understood machinery. We spent a Sunday at Lincoln Park, watching families feed peanuts to the elephant. We rode the elevated to the end of the line simply to see where the city stopped, only to discover rows of new houses advancing beyond the tracks. We stood outside the Board of Trade and watched messengers run as though carrying the pulse of the nation in folded slips of paper. Samuel disliked department stores, which he considered temples built to persuade ordinary people that dissatisfaction was a civic duty. I pointed out that those temples paid my wages. He then admitted that he liked their elevators. I admitted that I disliked nearly everything else. At Fairchild and Moore, Catherine returned from her wedding journey with photographs, a gold watch, and a new certainty about the proper arrangement of other women's lives. She accepted my explanation about the mistaken address, but remained wounded that I had not found her party after discovering the error. I apologized without describing why I had stayed. The truth belonged to Samuel and me, and I found myself protective of it. The office learned about him anyway. Chicago was too large for coincidence and too small for secrecy. A junior clerk saw us at a Sunday concert in Grant Park. By Monday, the correspondence room knew that I was keeping company with a mechanic. By Tuesday, Samuel owned a garage, an automobile factory, or a chain of livery stables, depending on the narrator. By Friday, someone had heard that he was divorced. That fact changed the quality of the attention. Married women offered warnings disguised as concern. Younger women asked questions disguised as jokes. Mr. Pritchard, the department superintendent, reminded me that Fairchild and Moore expected its female employees to preserve a character consistent with the firm's reputation. He did not explain how Sunday music threatened invoices, nor did he mention the two male buyers who openly kept mistresses in furnished rooms near the river. I had spent years making myself too useful to dismiss casually. Still, usefulness was not armor. A woman's employment rested on conduct rules broad enough to become any weapon required. I told Mr. Pritchard that my acquaintance was legally free, steadily employed, and entirely outside business hours. My voice remained respectful. The anger beneath it frightened even me. He cautioned me against defiance. I said nothing further, but I did not stop seeing Samuel. That refusal marked a change. The Eleanor who had accepted Catherine's invitation to avoid awkwardness would have retreated. She would have called prudence a principle and fear good judgment. The woman who had sat at the wrong wedding had learned how quickly a boundary disappeared when one chose to cross it. Samuel did not celebrate my rebellion. He understood its cost. When I told him about Mr. Pritchard, he suggested that we meet less visibly until gossip faded. I accused him of surrendering to it. He replied with painful accuracy that I could afford boldness only because he would carry none of the risk. A divorced mechanic might lose a customer to scandal. A woman clerk might lose the right to earn her living. Our first real quarrel followed. I believed he was ashamed of me. He believed he was protecting me. Both of us used pride to conceal fear. We separated at the corner of State and Van Buren in a cold rain, each walking too quickly in opposite directions. The next evening, I passed that corner on my way home. Samuel stood beneath the elevated structure holding an umbrella and a paper parcel of tulips. They were out of season and expensive. He had waited an hour. No grand reconciliation occurred. He admitted that protection offered without respect became another form of control. I admitted that courage did not require me to ignore consequences merely to prove they could not command me. We agreed to continue openly but carefully. I would decide what risks belonged to me. He would not disappear from my supposed benefit. That was how our true history grew. It lacked the elegant shape of the story told at Hawthorn House. There was no single crossing, no perfect return, no applause. There were dozens of crossings. Sometimes he waited, sometimes I did. Sometimes we both arrived angry and left less so. In July, he kissed me for the first time beside the lake. We had gone to Jackson Park, where fragments of the old World's Fair still haunted the landscape. The grand white buildings Samuel remembered were nearly all gone, destroyed by fire, demolition, and weather. One stone structure remained among new plantings, no longer the palace it had pretended to be. Samuel showed me where the machinery hall had stood and described the pumps he had installed as a young man. He remembered the blaze of lights, crowds speaking a dozen languages, and the conviction that the future had opened its doors. We sat on a bench facing the water. I told him that the fair must have seemed like a promise. He answered that it had been a promise, though not the sort he first imagined. Nothing stayed white. Nothing remained new. The future became a workplace like any other and needed people willing to repair it. The thought stayed with me. I had always imagined happiness as arrival at a finished place. A house, a marriage, a secure position, a life in which uncertainty had been removed. Samuel understood that all worthwhile structures required maintenance. When he kissed me, it was gentle and questioning. I was old enough to find excessive innocence dishonest, yet I felt something almost innocent then. Not because I had never been kissed, but because I had never before understood that consent could continue through each second of an embrace, offered and received like breath. On the train home, my hat sat crooked, and neither of us corrected it. 9. Summer gave way to a hot September. The city baked beneath smoke and dust. Horses collapsed in the streets. Children slept on fire escapes. The newspapers printed stories about reform commissions between advertisements for patent medicines and silk stockings. Mercer and Reed prospered. The unpaid invoices I'd found were collected. Samuel hired a young apprentice named Isaiah Brooks, a gifted 17-year-old, whose father worked at the stockyards. Thomas objected at first, not because Isaiah lacked ability, but because some customers would object to a colored mechanic touching their motor cars. Samuel answered that customers unable to recognize skill could take their machines elsewhere. I admired the decision. I also understood its cost. Chicago congratulated itself for being north of the Mason-Dixon line while drawing its own borders block by block. Isaiah arrived early, spoke little, and learned faster than anyone Samuel had trained. Several customers left. Others stayed because their engines did not care about prejudice. The workshop began repairing trucks for a delivery company and printing equipment for 2 foreign-language newspapers. Samuel discussed buying a new lathe on credit. I studied the figures and advised waiting. Banks were lending easily, too easily, and suppliers had begun extending terms that assumed prosperity would never end. At Fairchild and Moore, buyers ordered heavier Christmas inventory than any previous year. Every ledger in the city seemed to lean toward tomorrow. Samuel teased me for seeing storms in arithmetic. I reminded him of the White City and the bread lines after 1893. He agreed to postpone the lathe. The disagreement might have ended there if Margaret had not come to Chicago. I learned of her visit from Thomas, who assumed I knew. While we sorted invoices one Saturday, he mentioned that Samuel had spent Thursday afternoon with his former wife at an attorney's office. The paper in my hand became suddenly difficult to read. Samuel had told me the divorce was final. It was. What remained was the sale of a small house they had owned together near Bridgeport. A question about the deed required both signatures. None of this was deception in the legal sense, yet he had spent an afternoon with the woman whose telephone call he once waited for, and had not mentioned it during our walk the following evening. I finished the accounts, went home, and waited for him to explain. He called Sunday, as usual. We walked to a small square where men played chess beneath the trees. He spoke about the apprentice, a cracked gear, and Mrs. Bauer's plan to repaint the bakery. Each ordinary subject widened the silence around the missing one. At last, I asked about Margaret. Samuel stopped walking. The expression on his face told me more than any answer. He had intended to tell me, he explained, but could not find a way that did not give the visit greater importance than it deserved. The business concerned only the house. Margaret had remarried. She expected a child. She lived in St. Louis and had no desire to return. Every fact should have reassured me. Instead, I heard only that he had chosen silence. He believed the omission protected our peace. I believed it protected him from discomfort. The distinction mattered because his marriage had been the hidden truth inside our first invented story. I had not demanded access to every corner of his past, but I had believed that particular corner stood open between us. I asked whether seeing Margaret awakened regret. He admitted that it did, though not the regret I feared. He did not want her back. He regretted the people they had been together, 2 young adults too stubborn to confess unhappiness until unhappiness became their only common language. Her new life made their failure final, and finality carried grief, even when it also carried relief. It was a thoughtful, honest answer. I punished him for it. I withdrew my hand and said that perhaps he had not stopped waiting after all. The cruelty appeared on his face before I fully understood I had delivered it. He reminded me that honesty became impossible if each difficult truth was used as proof against him. We parted without resolution. For 10 days, I refused his calls at the office and sent word through Mrs. Dunn that I was not at home. Each refusal restored the old order of my life. I woke, worked, read, and slept. The quiet that had once felt safe now seemed constructed from absence. On the 11th day, a parcel arrived at the boarding house. Inside was the silver keepsake box we had won at Hawthorn House. I had left it at the workshop months earlier. Beneath it lay a sheet of paper containing no plea, only the address of the corner at Michigan and Jackson, and the time, 6 o'clock. The message was not quite direct speech, and perhaps that is why I allowed myself to obey it. At 6:15, I stood beneath the stone face of the Railway Exchange building. Traffic pressed through the intersection. Streetcars, cabs, wagons, bicycles, and 3 motorcars announcing themselves with horns. The air tasted of coal. Office workers poured from doorways. Samuel was not there. For 15 minutes, I watched every dark coat approach. 6 o'clock passed. Then 10 minutes. Anger rose, because I had returned and found the crossing empty. At 20 past, a delivery truck stopped in the roadway with a broken chain. Traffic tangled behind it. A policeman shouted. From beneath the truck appeared Samuel, coatless, his shirt blackened with grease. He had been there all along, helping a driver move the machine from the rails. When he saw me, exhaustion and relief crossed his face together. The perfection of our imaginary history collapsed, and something better took its place. He had not waited nobly beneath a lamp. He had become distracted by work. I had not arrived in a blue dress with certainty in my heart. I had come resentful and afraid. The crossing was noisy, dirty, and crowded with people who did not care what happened between us. I apologized first. Samuel apologized for concealing Margaret's visit. Neither apology cancelled the harm, but each made room around it. I explained that his silence had awakened an older terror, that I would always be the practical woman chosen after some more beloved woman had gone. He explained that my accusation had awakened his own, that failure, once proved, would remain the truest thing about him. We did not promise never to frighten each other again. We promised to name the fear sooner. Then we walked north through the evening crowd, carrying the silver box between us. 10. In October, the arithmetic changed. News came first from New York, where a failed attempt to corner the stock of a copper company shattered confidence in banks and trusts. Chicago newspapers printed assurances in the largest type they could afford. Depositors read those assurances and formed lines before the doors opened. Money did not disappear. It became afraid. At Fairchild and Moore, orders were canceled within days. Buyers who had boasted of record Christmas trade now searched for ways to return merchandise. Suppliers demanded payment before shipment. The superintendent dismissed 12 temporary clerks and reduced hours in 2 departments. Men gathered outside banks clutching passbooks. Firms paid wages in clearinghouse certificates because cash could not be obtained. The panic moved through the city faster than disease, invisible until it entered a household. Mercer and Reed suffered at once. The delivery company postponed repairs and failed to pay 3 outstanding invoices. Private owners stored their motor cars for winter rather than replace worn parts. One newspaper closed. Another offered Samuel half payment in scrip. Thomas had purchased steel on 30-day credit, expecting work that no longer existed. The decision not to buy the lathe saved them from immediate ruin. It did not save them from fear. Samuel worked longer hours while earning less. He repaired machines for customers who might never pay because refusing work felt like admitting the future had ended. Thomas proposed dismissing Isaiah. The apprentice had been hired last and had no family claim upon the partners. He was therefore the easiest expense to remove. Samuel refused. I admired him again, then discovered that admiration could coexist with anger. He kept Isaiah, but stopped paying himself. He fell behind on rent. He sold his good overcoat. He accepted every burden in silence until generosity became another form of pride. I learned the extent of the trouble by examining the shop ledger. Samuel had not asked me to come. For 2 weeks he claimed the accounts were under control and urged me to remain at Fairchild and Moore during the lunch hour rather than tiring myself. Suspicion brought me to the workshop after closing. In the drawer beneath the ledger, I found notices from creditors, an overdue insurance premium, and a demand for payment from the steel supplier. Our quarrel was quiet because the apprentice slept in the back room and Thomas sat beyond the glass partition. I accused Samuel of hiding the truth again. He argued that the debts belonged to the partnership and that I had no obligation to carry them. I answered that he had confused obligation with knowledge. I did not need the right to pay his debts in order to deserve the truth about the life into which he had invited me. He reminded me that we were not engaged. The statement was factual. It was also a door closed in my face. I asked whether that was how he saw our months together, as an arrangement without claims. He replied that claims were precisely what frightened him. His first marriage had begun with love and become an account in which every sacrifice demanded repayment. He would not build another bond from debt. I heard only refusal. He heard only threat. I left the workshop while rain beat on the roof hard enough to drown the machines. The following week, Fairchild and Moore dismissed me. Mr. Pritchard described it as a reduction necessitated by commercial conditions. My years of service, he said, would be remembered if trade improved. The firm retained 2 male clerks hired after me and promoted the superintendent's nephew to supervise what remained of the correspondence room. When I pointed this out, Mr. Pritchard reminded me that men supported families. I had supported myself since 19. Apparently, a woman's hunger counted less because it bore only her own name. I cleared my desk into a cardboard box. 12 years of employment produced 3 pens, a blotter, a framed photograph of my sister's children, a china cup, and a reference letter praising my neatness. Catherine Merritt cried and promised to speak on my behalf, though her husband expected her to resign before Christmas. The younger clerks watched in frightened silence. None could defend me without inviting selection. Outside, State Street continued selling abundance. Windows displayed French gowns, silver tea services, mechanical toys, and mountains of oranges beneath artificial snow. Behind the glass, prosperity appeared untouched. I stood among shoppers with $16 in my purse and understood that the city could conceal panic as easily as loneliness. My first impulse was to go to Samuel. My second remembered his statement that we were not engaged. I went home instead. For 3 weeks, I searched for work. Every office had a line of applicants. Men with families came first, then boys willing to work for half wages, then women whose experience could be converted into lower pay. I copied letters for an attorney by the page. I balanced Mrs. Dunn's books in exchange for a reduction in rent. I sold the pearl gray gloves to a second-hand dealer and received 30 cents. Samuel called twice. The first time I was truly out. The second time I listened from the stairs while Mrs. Dunn told him I had not returned. Shame held me still. I could not bear to arrive at his struggling shop as one more unpaid account. We had become victims of the same mistake. Each of us believed love meant sparing the other the sight of need. 11. Early in December, a letter arrived from Lydia Harcourt. The envelope was heavy and edged in mourning black. For a moment, I feared that someone from the wedding had died. Inside, Lydia explained that her father had suffered a seizure in November and was recovering slowly at home. While arranging household papers, she found my card attached to a silver sugar bowl. Samuel had already confessed the confusion, but Lydia had delayed writing because the story pleased her father so much that he insisted the bowl remain in use until its owner could be located. She invited me to take tea at the Harcourt residence and promised to return the gift, although she hoped I would not reclaim it before hearing what had become of the mistake. Under other circumstances, I would have declined. The Harcourts lived in a mansion on Prairie Avenue that belonged to the age when lumber, grain, and rail fortunes built stone fortresses south of the city. Their social world had no place for a dismissed clerk. Yet unemployment had stripped fear of some of its ceremony. I owned one decent suit, and it was already brushed. The house faced the avenue behind an iron fence. Its drawing room contained carved wood, Turkish carpets, portraits of severe ancestors, and enough furniture to exhaust an auctioneer. Lydia received me without the theatrical brightness she had worn as a bride. Marriage had not changed her face so much as responsibility had. Her father's illness and the panic had exposed weaknesses inside the Harcourt Motor Carriage Company, where her husband now worked. She remembered me from the wedding. More astonishingly, she remembered our story. Samuel had repaired the crimson motorcar again in August and explained that I had entered Hawthorn House by mistake. Lydia found the confession romantic rather than offensive. Her father called it proof that addresses, like markets, could not be trusted. The silver bowl had become a family joke. Then Lydia told me why she had written. Her husband's company had sold motor cars faster than it could organize records. Orders, parts, warranties, and customer accounts were spread among 3 offices. The panic made confusion dangerous. They needed a bookkeeper capable of understanding inventory and mechanical repairs. Samuel had recommended me months earlier, but the company's manager refused to employ a woman in a responsible position. Now 2 male bookkeepers had left, creditors demanded accurate statements, and principal had yielded to necessity. Lydia asked whether I would undertake a temporary examination of the accounts. I should have objected to being accepted only after men failed. Instead, I named a weekly fee higher than my wage at Fairchild & Moore. Lydia did not bargain. I began the next morning. The Harcourt Works stood near the river in a long building that had once manufactured farm equipment. Motorcars, in various stages of assembly, occupied the floor. Their polished bodies suggested luxury, but the process was human and strenuous. Men shaped panels over wooden forms, fitted engines, stitched leather, and painted striping by hand. The modern age arrived one filed surface at a time. The office was worse than Samuel's had ever been. Parts purchased for one model were charged to another. Dealers received cars on consignment without signed terms. Warranty repairs disappeared into general expenses. The firm appeared profitable only because it had not counted what it owed. For 10 days I worked from 8 in the morning until 9 at night. I traced orders, questioned foremen, compared serial numbers, and rebuilt the accounts. The factory manager disliked reporting to a woman and answered slowly until I demonstrated that his purchasing errors had tied up $6,000 in unusable French bearings. After that, he answered quickly. The work restored something in me that dismissal had damaged. Skill existed even when an employer refused to recognize it. A fact remained a fact when spoken by a woman. Columns balanced regardless of who held the pen. On the 11th day, I found a stack of repair contracts from Mercer and Reed. The Harcourt Company owed Samuel's shop more than $400 for warranty work. The invoices had been approved but never paid, because they were filed under customer service rather than accounts payable. $400 would cover the steel debt, rent, and wages through January. I prepared the payment authorization and placed it before Lydia's husband. He signed without objection after I showed him the contracts. I carried the bank draft to Indiana Avenue myself. Snow had begun that morning, the first heavy fall of the winter. It softened the roofs and turned the alleys pale, though beneath each wagon wheel the city remained black. The workshop doors were closed to preserve heat. Through the glass office wall, I saw Thomas at the bench and Isaiah sweeping metal shavings. Samuel stood beside the printing press, thinner than he had been in October. He saw me enter and did not move. I placed the draft on the bench. He read the amount and assumed I had persuaded the Harcourts to favor him. Pride rose at once. I stopped him before he could refuse. The money was not charity. It was payment for completed work, buried by incompetent accounting. His labor had possessed value even while the ledger denied it. That sentence reached both of us. My labor had possessed value after Fairchild and Moore dismissed me. His need had existed before I discovered the debt. Neither truth depended on concealment. Samuel asked how I had been living. I told him. I asked why he had sold his overcoat. He told me. The months of guarded tenderness between us seemed suddenly foolish, but foolishness does not make pain less real. He apologized for using the absence of an engagement as a shield. He had wanted the closeness of a shared life, while preserving the right to declare every burden his alone. That was not independence. It was fear with respectable manners. I apologized for disappearing when I lost my position. I had wanted him to see me as capable, and had mistaken being capable for never needing witness or help. The workshop was cold. Snow ticked against the windows. Thomas led Isaiah into the office and closed the door with exaggerated care, leaving us privacy while ensuring he could observe the outcome through the glass. Samuel did not ask me to forget our quarrels. He did not promise that money, work, or Margaret's memory would never trouble us. He asked whether we might stop protecting each other from reality. I agreed that we might try. Then I crossed the narrow space between us and kissed him with machine oil on his cheek and snow melting on my hat. Behind the glass, Thomas raised both arms in triumph. Isaiah turned away, with more dignity than either of us possessed. There was no applause, but I did not miss it. 12. The bank draft kept Mercer and Reed open, but one payment could not restore the economy. Recovery came in small, stubborn increments. The partners stopped waiting for prosperous customers and began looking for necessary work. Delivery companies still required wagons. Laundries still required engines. Tenements still required pumps, especially when winter pipes froze. Isaiah devised a method for repairing a commonly cracked motor housing without importing a replacement. Thomas refined it. Samuel persuaded 3 garages to send them the work. By February, the shop could pay modest wages each Saturday. At Harcourt Motor Carriage, my temporary examination became a permanent appointment. The title assigned to me was Assistant Records Clerk, because the manager could not persuade the board to place Chief Accountant beside a woman's name. The salary, after Lydia intervened, was that of a chief accountant. I accepted the contradiction for the moment and kept evidence for the future. My office overlooked the factory floor. Each morning I watched empty frames enter at one end and finished machines emerge at the other. No two were perfectly alike. Parts still had to be fitted by hand, adjusted to fractions the drawings could not predict. The process reminded me of Samuel's belief that the future was not a destination, but a workplace. We resumed our Sundays and Wednesdays. This time we practiced telling each other bad news before it ripened into secrecy. Some evenings our honesty was noble. On others it was tired, petty, or poorly timed. Samuel told me when a creditor's letter frightened him. I told him when the sight of a well-dressed wife stepping into a motor car made me feel the distance between labor and security. He admitted that my higher salary injured a foolish part of his pride. I admitted that his divorce still unsettled a foolish part of mine. Maiming those things did not enlarge them. Silence had done that. In March, he received a letter from Margaret announcing the birth of a daughter. He brought it to me unopened. I refused to read it for him. His past was not evidence to be surrendered at inspection. We sat together while he opened it. Margaret had written with kindness and finality, enclosing a photograph of the child. Samuel studied the tiny face for a long time. Grief passed through him without becoming betrayal. I held his hand and understood that love was not the absence of old sorrow. It was the place where sorrow no longer needed to hide. Spring returned reluctantly. Ice left the river in dark plates. Mud covered the streets. Shopkeepers washed soot from windows, revealing soot beneath. Chicago prepared for another season of declaring itself new. On the first anniversary of the Harcourt wedding, a cream envelope arrived at my office.
Lydia had invited Samuel and me to dinner at Hawthorn House. Her father had recovered enough to attend. The invitation listed the address in unusually large type, with the street number underlined twice. We went. The ballroom had been divided for a manufacturer's banquet, so Lydia reserved a private dining room upstairs. The red-cheeked woman in plum satin was there, now wearing green and still incapable of whispering. Mr. Harcourt greeted us as old conspirators. The silver sugar bowl occupied the center of the table, filled with yellow tulips. Lydia returned it ceremonially after supper. I told her she might keep it. The bowl had become more valuable as a mistake than it had ever been as a gift. She insisted that it belonged in the household created by the confusion. Samuel looked at me, but did not explain what household she meant. After dinner, the others arranged to leave us alone with such obvious care that privacy became a public performance. Samuel and I walked into the empty ballroom. The white roses were gone. The painted angels remained overhead, as indifferent as before. Chairs were stacked along one wall. A porter rolled a carpet at the far end. Without flowers, music, and guests, the room looked smaller. I could identify the place where our table had stood, and the patch of floor where we invented an intersection. Samuel carried the silver bowl under one arm. He led me to the center of the floor, and asked whether I remembered the woman who had returned. I did. He reminded me that the man in the story had waited for 3 evenings. The real man had now waited a year, although not passively and not alone. He had learned that waiting was not a claim upon another person. It was time offered in hope. He wanted to offer the rest of his time in the same spirit, if I wished to spend mine beside it. There was no ring in a velvet box. He had spent the money on the shop insurance and correctly suspected I would approve. There was no kneeling, no speech perfected for an audience, and no orchestra prepared to rescue the silence. He asked me to marry him. For a moment, the answer frightened me, because it was not the same as returning for supper or allowing a Wednesday call. Marriage could become another system of obedience. The law would give him rights over property and decisions that he had not earned merely by loving me. Society would expect me to exchange wages for gratitude and independence for protection. I'd watched such bargains described as romance. Samuel knew what held me silent. Over the previous year, we had discussed marriage too honestly to treat it as a fairy tale now. He had agreed that I would continue working. My savings would remain in an account under my control. The workshop would not swallow my wages without my consent. His debts would be visible, so would mine. If either of us needed solitude, it would not be mistaken for abandonment. These were not poetic promises, but they were the beams of a house that might stand. I considered the room in which a false history had allowed us to tell the truth. Then I considered the 12 months after, with their quarrels, omissions, ledgers, snow, and returns. I accepted. The porter at the far end dropped the rolled carpet and began applauding. Lydia and the red-cheeked woman emerged from behind the door, proving that the promised privacy had been even less real than I suspected. Mr. Harcourt opened champagne. Samuel looked embarrassed for perhaps 5 seconds before surrendering to laughter. The second applause at Hawthorn House meant less to me than the first, and more. The first had celebrated a beautiful fiction. The second celebrated two imperfect people who had survived the truth. 13. We married in September of 1908. There was never any question of holding the reception at Hawthorn House. The place possessed too much guilt, too many angels, and too dangerous a relationship with mistaken identities. Nor did we choose Hawthorn assembly rooms, though Catherine Merritt recommended its pastry chef. Instead, we used the meeting hall above Mrs. Bower's bakery. The room had plain white walls and 6 tall windows overlooking the street. Thomas and Isaiah built an arch from polished gears, brass tubing, and late summer branches. My sister came from Milwaukee with her children. Lydia brought the sugar bowl filled with asters.
Mrs. Dunn wore violet and inspected every guest as though personally responsible for public morality. We invited fewer than 50 people and knew nearly all of them. Catherine attended with George and admitted that my absence from her wedding had been noticed only when the final place cards were collected. The empty chair had troubled her for a week. Then, marriage, rent, and George's habit of leaving shoes in doorways replaced it with more immediate concerns. She forgave me. I forgave her for the invitation that had contained too many flowers and too little legibility. Lydia's father sent a motor car to carry us from the church. It was not the crimson machine Samuel had repaired. That one had finally surrendered its transmission and been sold to an enthusiast in Wisconsin. The new car stalled 2 blocks from the bakery. Samuel removed his coat and bent over the engine while I held my veil away from the grease. Our guests continued on foot, delighted by the fulfillment of a story most of them had never heard. After 10 minutes, Samuel found a loose electrical connection. We arrived late to our own reception, with oil on his cuffs and soot on the hem of my dress. It was the proper beginning. There was no master of ceremonies, but the red-cheeked woman attempted to assume the office until Mrs. Bower defeated her by serving dinner. Afterward, Thomas stood to recount how Samuel and I had met. He knew the entire false history, the true history, and several versions invented by customers. He became confused halfway through, placed the breakdown on State Street, changed the motorcar into a delivery truck, and claimed I had repaired it while Samuel held the lantern. We did not correct him. Stories belonged partly to those who loved the people inside them. Accuracy mattered in ledgers. In memory, meaning sometimes wore facts loosely. Samuel and I rented 4 rooms above the workshop. They were noisy, drafty, and ours. The front room looked toward the elevated tracks. The back windows overlooked an alley full of barrels. I brought my books, my father's adding machine, and the china cup from Fairchild and Moore. Samuel brought 2 chairs, a scarred table, a box of tools, and 12 years of newspapers he had somehow considered necessary. We argued about the newspapers for 3 days. We kept 6. Marriage did not cure either of us. I remained capable of turning fear into coldness. Samuel remained capable of mistaking silence for sacrifice. Work followed us upstairs. Money sometimes failed to. We discovered that affection could not decide who washed dishes, that fatigue made philosophers of neither of us, and that a small bed magnified every disagreement. We also discovered ordinary happiness. It lived in coffee carried to the other person before dawn. It lived in socks drying above the stove, in shared newspapers, in a hand resting at the small of my back while we passed in a narrow room. It lived in knowing the sound of Samuel's steps on the stairs, and in his knowing whether my day had gone badly by the way I set down my hat. It lived in repair. The shop grew as the city did. Motor cars multiplied. Horses remained, but each year they surrendered more streets to machines. Mercer and Reed added a second bay and installed the lathe they had once postponed. Isaiah completed his apprenticeship and became the 3rd partner, though several banks refused to place his name on a loan. By 1912, the sign above the door read, Mercer, Reed, and Brooks. Samuel painted the final name himself. I remained at Harcourt Motor Carriage until its directors could no longer pretend that the woman managing their accounts was an assistant. In 1910, they made me comptroller. The title caused comment. The balanced books caused silence. I trained other women to perform work formerly reserved for men and insisted that their wages appear in the same columns as their responsibilities. Progress arrived unevenly. Women in Illinois gained the right to vote for presidential electors in 1913, but full equality remained a promise receding down the road. Factories adopted guards on dangerous machines while demanding longer hours.
Reformers closed corrupt lodging houses and displaced the poor people living inside them. Magnificent buildings rose downtown as families crowded into rooms without clean water. The age called itself progressive because it preferred direction to destination. Samuel and I learned to prefer it too. In the summer of 1914, 7 years after the wrong wedding, Hawthorn House was demolished to make way for a taller commercial building. Lydia sent us a newspaper clipping. For an afternoon, I felt grief for the painted angels, the brass palms, and the precise patch of floor on which our imaginary lives began. Samuel found the demolition foreman and purchased one small piece of the ballroom's oak floor before it was carted away. He planed it smooth in the workshop. From the wood, he made a narrow frame for our wedding photograph. In that photograph, his cuff bears a faint oil stain. My hem is dark with soot. We are not posed beneath roses. We stand before an arch made of gears and branches, surrounded by people who know our names. The silver sugar bowl still sits on our table. Its plating has worn thin along one handle. Most days it holds ordinary sugar. Every September, I fill it with asters. When people ask how Samuel and I met, I decide how much truth they can bear. Sometimes I tell them about Hawthorn House and the invitation to another wedding. Sometimes I begin with a broken motor car at Michigan and Jackson. Samuel always watches to see which history I choose, and if I change a detail, he follows without hesitation. Both stories are false in places. Both are true where it matters. I did not meet him at an intersection. He did not wait there for 3 evenings. I did not return on the 4th. Yet our life became a series of crossings at which one of us might have continued alone and did not. We returned after pride, after silence, after fear, after failure. We learned that returning was not the same as retreating. The right person did not ask you to become smaller when you came back. On that rainy evening in 1907, I confused 3 letters and reversed 2 numbers. I missed Catherine Bell's wedding, lost a silver bowl, damaged my reputation, and sat beside a stranger whose hands were marked by work. For years, I had believed a correct life depended on reaching the place printed on the invitation. I was wrong. Sometimes the address prepared for us is only the address other people understand. Sometimes an error opens a door that caution would have kept closed. Sometimes a borrowed story reveals the life we have been afraid to ask for. I went to the wrong wedding. I arrived exactly where I needed to be.